I'm going to introduce our former President Washington, who has some remarks on the Constitution, and then James Madison will tell us about the Constitution and how we've fallen so far astray from what they attended. Mr. Washington, President.
Good evening. I want to make sure that everyone back there can hear me. Oh, what is this?
Newfangled from Ben Franklin. Now that must be much better. I'm not sure how this works, but that is very good. I've made some notes here that we should listen to very carefully. I am basically going to set the stage for the architect of the Constitution of the United States. I'm going to define the terms of how federal elected officials should approach the governance of the new United States of America. I'll be asking questions for you to ponder on and decide. And there are some very important questions. Then I will transition over to James Madison, and he will give you a further insight into the depths. I read in the newspaper an interesting statement by Dr. Ben Franklin. And it says, a Mrs. Powell of Philadelphia asked Benjamin Franklin, "Well, doctor, what have we got? A republic or a monarchy?" With no hesitation whatsoever, Franklin responded, "A republic if you can keep it." And that is the theme tonight in the 18th century that hopefully will progress beyond the 18th century. If you can keep it, it being the Constitution of the United States. You have to remember, at this point in time, in the 18th century, every single country in the world is ruled by an imam, a king, a queen, a czar, or even a pope. That is the rule of the country. You must remember that there is no difference between the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, and the Constitution that's being proposed to the United States of America. They are all twinned together. The idea is to say that we will no longer be governed by an independent family or independent authority. We will assume a situation. You have to understand that all of you, just a short time ago, were a subject. Does anyone understand the difference of a subject between a subject and a citizen? In 1776, July 4th, you all became citizens of the United States of America. That is a very important thing that we all need to remember. That we are no longer subjects because our whole life, including my whole life, my whole family, has been a subject of a king. And I was not an avid revolutionary. It took time, but I realized the need to become a revolutionary and to form something new. Now here is another statement that sums up the state of affairs. This statement was made in Boston in 1770. This statement was made by a pastor of a church, of all places, in a sermon. That pastor's name was Mayor Biles. He said, as it's written down, and he's been known to be a sarcastic fellow. He said, in church on a Sunday in Boston, remember this, Boston being the hotbed of patriotic activity, he had the audacity to say, which is better, to be ruled by one tyrant 3,000 miles away, or by 3,000 tyrants merely 1 mile away? Think about that for a minute. He lost his congregation in one sermon. They left. No one came back. The only reason he stayed in Boston is because he had a civil contract. Remember that idea? He had a civil contract to remain in the parsonage. That shows you the thought process of what it means to be a subject and a citizen. How dare he insinuate that there will be 3,000 tyrants merely 1 mile away? As you can see, Mather Biles is not on my list of good people. However, he paid the price as being a loyalist. We have 8 years, we spent 8 years with one defined enemy, the king and his minions in Parliament. 8 years, which brought us to a new form of government, of which we did not have. We started with the Declaration of Independence. We transitioned over to the Articles of Confederation. The question I have is, who is our common enemy? Is it ourselves? Think about that for a moment. Is the common enemy of this United States of America from here on out going to be ourselves? Ponder on that. I hope not. The situation as it stands today, we have 13 entities which are called states. A state in 18th century terminology means a nation, a separate nation. How can 13 nations survive together? Obviously, there are problems, and each one of you, from each one of your separate states, are experiencing these problems today. Quite frankly, I am very concerned that this Constitutional Convention may not work. However, I understand the merit of the people who understand the need, and hopefully the representatives of each state will be given the authority to make decisions on behalf of a centralized nation. Here are the differences. Religion. I'm an Anglican. I grew up in the Church of England. In the northern colonies, they're all Anabaptists. They rejected the Church of England. That's why they came to the northern colonies. Virginia was very much of a loyalist colony. So, obviously, an Anabaptist, a Congregationalist Anabaptist, would be rather concerned about my connection to the Church of England. Geography. The population of the northern colonies is rather dense. There is a sparse population in the southern colonies from Virginia down. Cultural attitudes of life. Virginians are perceived as gamblers. They sit around and drink bourbon and branch water. They smoke too much. And they have a thing called slaves. They live a privileged life. Voting rights are another issue as well. And monetary differences. We have 13 different types of monetary differences in the colonies today, creating huge economic problems. And now, here is the biggest point. $21.5 million is the combined debt of all of our states. A combined debt that is unbelievable at $21.5 million for the price of winning a war against Great Britain and the King. How do we handle that $21.5 million in debt? And I'm sure James Madison has some ideas. From here on out, we have to understand that there's going to have to be some compromise and some conciliation among the states. And my main purpose of being at the Constitutional Convention is to help promote that conciliation. These are the two viewpoints I would like to bring up if you think about. Statements by me. Few men have virtue to withstand the highest bidder. Think about that for a minute. Few men have virtue to withstand the highest bidder. The second point, decision-making, like coffee, needs a cooling process. A cooling process. With that, we have a monumentous attempt that we have to make to revise the Articles of Confederation and bring this country into some sort of semblance of control. And I would like to welcome my friend, my cohort, Mr. James Madison.
Thank you, President Washington. I have been called the chief architect of the most important political experiment in human history. You all know who the father of our country is, George Washington. I imagine you all know who wrote the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson. And if you were listening to the introduction, perhaps you can tell me who is the father of the Constitution. It is I, James Madison. Very good. And since you're doing so well, perhaps you can tell me who wrote the Bill of Rights. I'll give you a clue. It's the same fellow. It is I, James Madison. If you were to sum up the Declaration of Independence in one sentence for a child, how would you do it? What does that document say in one sentence, the Declaration of Independence? Anybody want to take a shot at that? Perfect answer. It says, we want to be free. That's exactly what it says. How about the Constitution? What is a Constitution? Now there's a toughie. It's what you in your time might call the owner's manual. It's the user's guide. You want a free country? Wonderful. Here's how to make it work. How about the Bill of Rights? How would you explain that to a child? It's a list, isn't it? It's a list of our rights. It's a list of our freedoms. The Bill of Rights is the definition of freedom. These three documents are what make us Americans. You ever think about that? What do you have in common with all other Americans between here and Philadelphia? The answer is here. It's the belief and the principles behind these three documents: the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights. That's what we share. That's what we hold dear. It's the glue that holds us together as a people. It's what defines us as Americans. Who would have thought that the pen could be such a mighty instrument? In your time, one of your newspaper columnists, George Will, who's a rather good historian, by the way, used to teach at the university, Dr. Will once wrote that if we truly believe that the pen is mightier than the sword, that our nation's capital would have been called Madison, D.C. instead of Washington, D.C. Well, that's a rather nice thing to say. Thomas Jefferson was once asked what he thought of me. He astonished his questioner with his immediate and forceful response. Jefferson said simply, "James Madison is the greatest man in the world." Well, that's a rather nice thing to say, too. We met here in Philadelphia in 1787 because we had a problem. We were 13 states. We went from being 13 colonies to being 13 states. And as President Washington told you, the word state means country. And we acted like 13 countries. We squabbled, as countries are wont to do. We squabbled over borders between one state and another. To make matters worse, we weren't paying our bills. One state or another would always find some reason not to kick in its share of the money needed to run the country as a whole. And people like George Washington and Benjamin Franklin and I were very concerned about this. We feared a breakup of the Union. We feared national bankruptcy. We feared national dishonor. And so, we met in 1787 in Philadelphia, and there was only one delegate who showed up with a comprehensive plan as to how to solve our problem. And I'll give you one guess as to who that delegate might have been. It was I. And my plan became known as the Virginia Plan, because after all, I am a Virginian. And the Virginia Plan is the basis of our Constitution today. Speaking of which, I have a question for you. If I were to ask you, what is the essence of the U.S. Constitution? What is it that makes that document work? Why are you still free 200 years later? Anybody know? The answer is two words. Divided power. Or you could say limited power. We knew that too much power in one person or one place was bad. You didn't have to convince us of that. After all, we had just fought an 8.5-year war to get rid of too much concentrated power. A king. We certainly didn't want to recreate that, even with an elected government. So what did we do? We divided power. First, we divided between the state governments and the federal government. Each has its own turf, and they're supposed to stay on their own turf, which they sometimes forget. And then we divided power within the federal government. The president has some power, the Congress has some power, and the courts have some power. And just to be on the safe side, we even divided the Congress in half, creating a Senate and a House of Representatives. Divided power. Every paragraph, every sentence, every clause of this document is designed to divide and limit power. To use a term from your time, the default setting on the Constitution is that if it's not specifically listed as a federal power, a power of Congress, by default then, it must then be a state power or an individual citizen power. That's reiterated in the Bill of Rights in the 10th Amendment. A good one to read. If you had asked the average colonist before the Revolution, what do you want from the British government? He would have given you a 3-word answer. Leave me alone. And that sentiment pervades all 3 of these documents. If you read the Declaration of Independence sometime, which I hope you will, most people read that beautiful prose that Jefferson wrote in the beginning, and they ignore the bottom two-thirds of the document, which is a big long list of grievances against the British government, all of which can be summed up in 3 words: leave me alone. And if you read the Bill of Rights sometime, which I hope you will, it's another big long list of things the government cannot do to you, all of which can be summed up in 3 words: leave me alone. And if you read the Constitution sometime, which I hope you will, it's a document that's designed to create a government that will have enough power to do what it has to do, but otherwise will leave you alone. I got a question for you. If I were to ask you what caused the American Revolution, what would be your answer? Anybody want to take a shot at that? Taxes. Now, I don't know if it's an issue in your time or not, but it was in mine. And that's what most people would say. It's important to remember, though, there was more to it than that. Think of who we were. We were 13 British colonies. Proud to be British colonies. Why? Because English people, even though they lived under a king, had at least some rights. For example, the king couldn't just wake up one morning and say, "I don't like you, we're cutting your head off today." Other countries, yes. England, no. In England, you had a trial first, a jury trial, in front of 12 ordinary people. Now, if they think your head should come off, then off it comes. But the king couldn't do it. This was known as one of the rights of an Englishman, the right to a jury trial. The king couldn't just wake up one morning and say, "I don't like you either, we're doubling your taxes today." Other countries, yes. England, no. Parliament did that. It wasn't really a democratic body in those times, but at least it was some form of representation. Another one of the rights of an Englishman, taxation with representation, but not without. Perhaps you've heard the phrase, "a man's home is his castle." That's an English phrase. The king's men can't just come bursting into your house without a search warrant. Another one of the rights of an Englishman, the right to be secure in our own homes against government intrusion. Well, we're English colonies. We figure we have those rights, don't we? What does England say? Sorry, you're just colonists. You don't have the same rights as regular English people do. We'll tell you what your rights are going to be. We'll tell you what your taxes are going to be. And as a matter of fact, we don't like the way those American juries have been letting people go. Particularly smugglers who might have forgotten to pay their taxes. So we're going to start sending you back to England for trial, or Canada, in front of a judge only. No jury. A judge appointed by the king, of course. You like that? We didn't like it either. Not one bit. So we protest. First thing you know, there's 342 chests of tea being dumped into Boston Harbor one night. My, how disrespectful. What does England do? She clamps down. Hard. Sends soldiers over here. Thousands of them. Some of whom are now living in your houses, keeping an eye on you. You like that? We didn't like it either. Not one bit. We thought we had the right to be secure in our own homes against government intrusion. Now the government's living in there with us. What does that say about your rights as an Englishman? What's my point? My point is, this war was fought over a lot more than a 3-cent tax on a pound of teeth. This was a rights issue. This was a liberty issue. This was a fundamental difference of opinion on the proper relationship between the individual citizen and his government. Well, I must close. President Washington and I are very grateful to have you here tonight, and we are honored that you have invited us to speak, and we are gratified that you appreciate the freedoms that our generation gave to yours. Thank you. I am your humble servant. Do we have time?
Gentlemen, we'll take interchange some questions from our audience.
So we have President Washington come up too then?
And I will kick it off with my own question. Looking back from the perspective of today, what would you have done differently?
Well, that's an excellent question. I think that President Washington or anyone else in our generation would A, be very pleased that the Constitution still exists and that you're still free 200 years later. That's a remarkable accomplishment. In human history, that's unheard of. Prior to what we did, there had been experiments with democracy before. They were all short-lived. The Greeks invented democracy in Athens 2,000 years ago. It didn't last very long. First thing you know, they're taken over by the Spartans, and then the Macedonians, and then the Romans, and the first thing you know, they're being told what to do by an emperor. And that I think would get to the answer to your question, is that historical perspective. And there are some countries, as you probably know, sir, that have adopted our Constitution around the world. Almost word for word. Many countries have used this as their model. And over time, through one emergency or war or another, their presidents have accumulated more and more power. And one of the things that George Washington did in his 8 years as president, he was very careful not to overstep his bounds. In his State of the Union addresses, he didn't even suggest legislation. That's a congressional function. Legislation originates in Congress. It doesn't originate in the White House. He would describe a problem and suggest to the Congress, well, maybe you should address this issue. But he was very careful. He knew everything he did was setting a precedent. And that was one precedent he wanted to set, is that you don't want too much power in one person or one place. And I think history will bear that out as good advice.
This question is very close to my heart. Remember, I had to find generals and officers to guide this ragtag army against the most vicious, well-prepared, well-funded Army and Navy in the whole world at that time. The important aspect that I looked at in every one of my generals was character. I did make a flaw in Benedict Arnold. That is a problem, I'll admit to that. But the overall majority is looking at the character of the person. We have a tendency in the States to look at influence as some sort of moniker that leads someone to be able to govern correctly. Influence does not make a good governor. And I revert back to my original statement that I said at the end. Few men have virtue to withstand the highest bidder. Remember, when a general, and Mr. Britton mentioned this, when a general was victorious in the 18th century, it was a given notion that they would assume the kingship of the victorious country. I astounded Congress in Annapolis. Only very few understood what I was going to do. I relinquished my commission, which put Congress into a disarray. I basically said, I leave this up to you, not one person, but a group of men who would have the influence to understand that there is a congeniality of professionalism in order to make the controls of the checks and balances of power to work. Hopefully, as the years go by, this will stand in place. But remember, you are now a citizen and not a subject. It is up to you to figure out which person will govern your locality, your whatever setup you have locally, but more important, the federal elected officials need to have the character that don't go just on influence, but understand the principles of the Constitution. And I'm not a Baptist minister, but I feel like one right now. Thank you.
My honor to talk to the Founding Fathers. Because of the brilliance of the Constitution, especially the Bill of Rights, America is that shining city on the hill that Ronald Reagan, and I've traveled all over the world in the military as a civilian, and people still see us as that beautiful beacon on the hill, largely because of the brilliance within the document you wrote. And I'm specifically looking at the First Amendment as well as the Second Amendment, because you codified those. We still have those rights today. However, there's two things you left out. One is the balanced budget. And they warned about that in your time. Alexis de Tocqueville, who was probably born about the time he died, warned about the power of the public purse and the tyranny that could result from that. That's one. You did not specifically order, writing the Bill of Rights, a balanced budget, and you did not define marriage as a right. And now we've lost that. As good Christians, we assume that's true. But why did you leave those two out, or did you even think to put them in the Bill of Rights?
Interesting questions. To answer the second one first, the issue of marriage did not come up in our time, and even if it had, it would not be a federal matter. And that's something that seems to gradually have gotten forgotten over time, is that if Virginia wants to let you marry a chimpanzee, that's up to Virginia. In Massachusetts, they might disagree, that's up to Massachusetts. And as one person once said, murder is not a federal crime unless you drag the body across state lines. But most issues, particularly the police matters and such, are state matters. It should not be a federal crime. To get back to the budget issue, we started out owing money. Now we in Virginia, God bless us, had pretty much paid off our war debts before the Constitutional Convention, because we're Virginians and we're good folk.
$350,000 is what we owe.
Now, those irresponsible New Englanders, that's another story.
2.5
And
Who's counting?
And Alexander Hamilton, who had no allegiance to any state because he was born illegitimate in the West Indies, as John Adams once described him, he was the bastard brat of a Scotch peddler. That's another story. Alexander Hamilton and I were on the same page when it came to creating the Constitution, but afterwards, he became a loose constructionist, and I was a strict constructionist. I believed that the Constitution should be interpreted the way it was written, that it was an agreement between we the people and the federal government. We the people gave power to it, not the other way around. Prior to this, you only had rights because some king decided to grant them to you. The assumptions here are upside down from that. Here the assumption is that power and rights are held by you. And then you decide to dispense as much power as you wish to your government, and to surrender whatever rights you might wish to surrender to the government to let it do what it has to do. So anyway, to get back to the money matter, the federal government assumed the state debts as part of a deal that Thomas Jefferson and I made with Alexander Hamilton. We wanted the capital to be further south than Philadelphia, so that the southern states wouldn't be ignored. We felt that we might get steamrolled by the more populous northern states. So we decided on Washington, D.C., and in return for that, we agreed to let the federal government assume all the state war debts from the Revolution. So we started out in debt. But you'd like Jefferson and me, because under Thomas Jefferson and I, we had almost every penny of it paid off. We kept the size of the government down, and we kept taxes down. We believed in limited government.
There was some controversy. You mentioned your time as Secretary of State under President Jefferson as to whether the Louisiana Purchase was constitutional.
Oh, I'm glad you brought that one up. And you keep in mind, you're speaking to a strict constructionist, one who does not believe that the necessary and proper clause can be stretched all out of its original meaning, or the general welfare clause applies to everything under the sun. But the Louisiana Purchase is absolutely constitutional. Thomas Jefferson, to give him credit, was a little bit nervous that maybe it isn't. We hadn't expanded the size of the country, and here we are, we're going to double the size. In the greatest bargain of the century, by the way, penny an acre is a pretty good price. But it's absolutely constitutional. You don't have to stretch the meaning of the Constitution at all. Why? Because it's a treaty. It's an agreement between nations, between us and France. That's the definition of the word treaty. And you can have some minor deal perhaps to reduce a tariff here and there, but anything major, any major agreement between countries is a treaty. If you look at the original document, the Louisiana Purchase, right across the top, it doesn't say Louisiana Purchase, it says one word, treaty. Well, the Constitution gives the power to the President, in plain English, to negotiate treaties. That's one of his functions. Article 2. And it gives the power to the Congress to approve treaties. The Senate ratifies the treaty by a 2/3 vote, and then the House votes to authorize any money necessary to adopt the treaty, which is precisely what happened with the Louisiana Purchase.
I could go on all night, but we have some other questioners here. Shirley.
Hi. President Washington and Secretary Madison, you fellows have done a marvelous President. Oh, I'm sorry. We talked about Secretary. Excuse me. But anyway, your wisdom gave us the great country that we now have. You set the rules. You were forward-thinking. But now we find ourselves 200 plus years later where it's evident that our people in power are not following the Constitution. They are twisting it for their own purposes. And what do you think, in your wisdom, we talk about voting, it's in the hands of our citizenry, but it seems like it's watered down. What do you think we can do?
I hate to go back to this once again, but let me rephrase this and say it directly. Few men have virtue to withstand the highest bidder. And that, if you think about that, has become a potential for a problem. And that's why Congress has got to enforce the checks and balances against the president and the judiciary as allotted within the Constitution. If there's an abrogation of authority, which appears to be occurring 200 plus years later, with an abrogation of authority, you might as well shred this document up. And it's up to the citizenry to remind, elect, and impeach as necessary to restructure those representatives who will follow in a congenial atmosphere the written document that we have as our template. Beyond doing that, hopefully, we will not have another 8 years of revolution. And there are places in the Constitution to prevent that to occurring, but it takes people who are citizens and not subjects. And no matter how you understand this, you have to understand that there are people who are willing to become subjects and not citizens. I rest my case.
I would add one minor thought to that. That it comes down to, does the end justify the means? And if it's your guy in the White House and he's exceeding his authority, he's doing things with an executive order instead of by going to Congress and asking for a law to be passed, or signing an agreement with some other country and pretending it's just a minor deal. It doesn't rise to the level of a treaty. I would remind you and your friends, who may be of the opposite party, that it's not always going to be your guy in the White House. The end doesn't justify the means. The process matters, because it's not always going to be your guy that's taking all this power to the White House. There are 3 branches of government, not just one.
What you said, it was giving a little minor revelation. What you said about the few people have the virtue to withstand the highest bidder applies not only to the politicians and the presidents and the members of Congress, it applies to the citizens. When the politician comes and says, vote for me, I'm going to give you this, and this free, how many voters have the moral fortitude to say no?
I remember there was someone that mentioned this. I'm not sure if it was in my time or not. You might know future. Some foreign visitor visited the United States and said, as soon as the populace figures out that they can vote money to themselves in so many words or less, as soon as they find that out, the republic is lost. Does that sum it up for you?
Seems to be what we're experiencing today.
As soon as the populace figures out they can vote money for themselves, the republic is lost.
That's where we are.
Bill?
That has a name. It's called tyranny of the majority. And you took my question, basically. But there is one thing I would like to cover, and that was, back in your days, it was not easy to go out and get everybody to vote. They were scattered all over the place. So most of the politicking that went on, all right, in Congress, all right, as far as who's going to be president and who, so on and so forth. Okay, and it seemed to have worked out well. But now we go to the public, and things have seemed to the tyranny of the majority, all right, and the giving out of gifts, and how do we get back to, I guess, that feeling that you had back there about developing a brand spanking new country, and this is the way we wanted it run. I believe you guys, all right, had this inspiration. I don't think we have it. There's just way too much apathy anymore. It's as if you don't agree with me, I'm not even going to bother going out and vote.
Yeah, President Washington is mentioning that I should talk about voting rights. The Constitution, by the way, specifically says that the states are the ones that will run elections and determine who gets to vote and who doesn't get to vote, and so forth and so on. What this gentleman touched on, it's one of the reasons why we had the Electoral College, is what you're describing, is because we knew that we were a large geographic entity, where voters in the southern states wouldn't have any idea about the candidates in the northern states and vice versa. They would tend to vote for their local guy because they knew him. And so the Electoral College, the idea there was, well, you'll vote for an influential citizen in your area, and then he'll go to the Electoral College, and they'll figure out from there who's going to become president. The electors could vote for anybody they wanted to, not necessarily who the people back home wanted. Because the idea was they can go there and find out about this guy from up north. Hey, maybe he could be a good president, and so on and so forth. So, now in your time, communication's better, and you could maybe argue that that's not necessary anymore. One other thing that I would briefly mention is that the senators were not directly chosen by the people at all, as the Constitution was written. They were chosen by the state legislatures. And they were elected for 6-year terms, which was unheard of in the northern colonies. It was a real tough sell for me to go to somebody from Massachusetts and say, well, we're going to have these senators elected for 6 years. In Massachusetts, nobody served for more than 1 year in the Massachusetts state government, including the governor. Their philosophy was, where annual elections end, tyranny begins, which goes to what you're describing. They didn't trust them any further than they could throw them. 11 months and 29 days later, we can get this guy out. And now we're coming along saying, well, we want the president for 4 years, senators for 6, congressmen for only 2. So the idea was, well, the Congress will be closely tied to the tyranny of the majority, as you said, or the temporary popularity of whatever's in the masses. But you got the Senate to cool things off. As President Washington said, laws sometimes need to have a little time to cool off before they get enacted. Get rid of the popular passion for a little bit. Delay is not always a bad thing.
Flash. Our field trip this summer was to Boston, West Point, and other patriotic parts of this country where freedom was founded. If George III came back and saw how much we vested in the office of president, he would laugh himself to death. Frederick Muhlenberg and the Old North Church and other places were not afraid. They were called the Black Robe Regiment because they wore their Continental Army uniform under their vestments of the church. Can you say something to the millions of Americans that refused to vote in 2012 and gave us another 4 years of you-know-who? How we can stop this lack of responsibility? May I remind you that Jesus Christ, after he prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane in the book of Luke, was asked by one of his disciples, probably Peter, how many swords do you have? Lord, we have 2. That is enough. So we are not commanded to be pacifists or inactive mollycollies in the Bible, and that is what the Constitution is found on. I don't care what the Supreme Court says or anybody else at the ACLU. How can we get Americans to revive the spirit of patriotism that was bought with the blood of the Patriots and not forget that what we do today affects the grandchildren of tomorrow?
Sir, education. Like I've said before, there is a trend in the human mind to become a subject and have somebody else make decisions for you and live by those decisions as long as life is comfortable. I need to go back to my own upbringing. I was the product of a second marriage. I was the oldest son. I had 2 older brothers, and I was not a victim, but I was in the social institution called primogeniture, which means that the oldest son inherits everything from the father. When the oldest son passes on, that wealth passes to the second son. When the second son dies, if there's a third son, me, I receive the inheritance. On that way, sir, I was able to gain an adequate education. Private tutelage, thankfully, for my 2 older stepbrothers. But in that, I need to say that the only way that I can understand to prevent what you're saying in the future is called education, and to define to people what it means to be a subject. We all know what it means to be a subject. It's not a pleasant position to be in. We need to develop citizens who understand the rights and the energy to be a citizen.
Yeah.
I'll add one more thought that actually goes contrary to what you're saying. In our time, the right to vote varied, of course, from state to state. And, however, they did have one thing in common. Typically in states, you had to be a free person, a male, and have property. So voting was not as widespread as you might think. But even those 3 weren't common to all 13 states. For example, in New Jersey, women could vote, right from day 1, 1776, as long as they met the other qualifications. They had to either own property or $50 worth of tools, which meant that you were an established tradesman, that you were a journeyman, a carpenter or whatever. You had a business. All 13 states required that you had to have at least some property, some kind of a farm or a house, or enough tools to demonstrate that you were an established tradesman. Why? Because they wanted you to be an established member of the community, somebody with something to lose. They didn't want people voting that were just passing through town. So that's a little different philosophy, perhaps, than what you're describing. But that was the philosophy of our time, is they wanted established members of the community to vote. not just anybody. And of course, New Jersey, 30 years later, changed their mind and rescinded the women's right to vote. What were we thinking? Anyway.
Now, looking back on it, wasn't it a mistake to give women the vote?
I'm not from New Jersey. I was educated there, but that's...
The right of free Englishmen to keep and bear arms was recognized on the field of Runnymede 800 years ago. And you fought a revolution over that right. The Battle of Lexington was to protect the cannon and gunpowder at Concord.
I would point out one quick thing on this. I know we're running out of time. The Second Amendment says that a militia being necessary for a free state, the right of the citizens to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And so I know people in times after ours will look at that and say, oh, so what that means is only people in the militia or the National Guard have a right to bear arms. That's not the right interpretation. Keep in mind what the word militia meant to us. The militia was not a uniformed service. As this gentleman just pointed out, at the Battle of Lexington and Concord, who did the fighting? The Continental Army? No. It didn't exist yet. The militia did that fighting. Who's militia?
Everybody under 45 years old.
Exactly. Militia is everybody. It was your obligation to be in the militia if you were a male in most states or colonies over the age of 16. There were some exceptions. If you're over 65, you were typically exempt, although some states, like Massachusetts, even people over 65 were called out. They called them the alarm company. When there's a really bad problem, bring out the old guys. They know what to do. But if you were already holding some government office, you were exempt. If you were a gunsmith, you were exempt. They figured practicing your trade is more valuable than serving on the front lines. But, so my point is, the militia is everybody. That's why we want an armed citizenry. It's not to protect the rights of hunters. It's long-term liberty insurance. It's to keep this thing alive. It's to protect you from your own government.
One quick example. Dorchester Heights in Boston. 1775, I'm sent down there by Continental Congress to organize the militia. Interesting experience. That's a whole other 2 hours to discuss that. What we did was to, thankfully, Henry Knox was able to bring down cannon from Fort Ticonderoga. They did a surprise attack on Fort Ticonderoga. He brought the cannon down, and we in one night, the militia, not the regular Continental Army because there was none, the militia mounted those cannons on Dorchester Heights and pointed those cannons down at the British Navy. They woke up the next morning and they said, oh, we are potentially going to be blown apart by those cannon on Dorchester Heights. It worked. They left. One caveat. We had no gunpowder! So what does that say? That gunpowder was seized over and over again by the king's minions and the lobster backs. That hopefully will never happen again because the militia put those cannons up and said, "We will fire." Thankfully, they didn't know we didn't have any gunpowder, but that principle stands in place. Henry Knox, militia, grabs the cannon from Fort Ticonderoga, brings it down. We didn't have time to amass the gunpowder, but that demonstration of force sent the British Army out of Boston, liberated Boston, and sent them to New York where they felt more comfortable with loyalists.
One last item which I think is worth mentioning. We didn't really trust professional armies in our time. Why? Because we knew our history. Professional armies throughout history for thousands of years were the king's goon squad. That's what the king used to oppress his own people, was his army. And they were loyal to him because he handed out goodies and money to them. So we trusted the militia. We trusted the ordinary farmer, the ordinary townsperson, the ordinary tradesman. We knew he was safe. The professional armies in our time didn't have a real good track record. So that's why the Second Amendment. We wanted an armed militia, an armed citizenry, so that they could protect themselves from tyranny. In your time, you don't have to worry about your own army being your enemy, but that's unusual in history. Worth noting.
This is where Mr. Madison and I differ. I uphold to a professional army. That's another story for another few hours, but thank you very much.
Glad you got to trust them.
I'm going to indulge you for one more question. Did you have a sense in 1787 this could work? This was going to become, the country was going to stretch across the continent, and it was going to become the most influential, most powerful nation in the world, an example for the entire world. Do you have any sense of what you were doing?
We had big ideas. We've always had big ideas. But we were not necessarily optimistic that the Constitution would last indefinitely. We tried to design it so that it would, but even President Washington mentioned, if this lasts 20 years, that'll be great. Some people would say that it's a living document, and on that I would comment that be careful what you mean by that. It's designed to live through the amendment process, so that if you want to change it, you can. Do you want 18-year-olds to vote? Great, pass an amendment. Do you want to ban drinking? Fine, pass an amendment. You want to change your mind a few years later? That's okay, pass another amendment. That's how it's supposed to live, is through the amendment process. You've done it 27 times. It's not impossible. But the idea of taking the existing words and pretending they mean something different now would send shudders down my back and down Thomas Jefferson's back. As President Washington said, at that point, you might as well throw it in the fire. And as Jefferson said, at that point, you don't need a written constitution anymore. You might as well have a blank piece of parchment. If you're going to let 9 lawyers wearing funny black robes rewrite this thing, then you're making a mistake.
I just want to thank you, both President Washington and President Madison, for sharing your time with us this evening and your thoughts on the Constitution. And thank you for your profound service to our country, both on the battlefield and in office and in drafting the Constitution. We just hope that we can keep this thing going a while longer.